Okay. All right, so I'm recording. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this On Think Tank's webinar. This is a very special edition of the webinar. We have two guests with us. Peter Taylor from IDRC, who until recently led the Think Tank Initiative, and Sarah Lucas from the Hewlett Foundation, who has been involved in the Think Tank Initiative for almost as long as it's been around, but from a slightly different point of view, as one of the funders of this initiative. So after 10 years of supporting think tanks around the world, we figured there'd be lots of lessons that have been learned and that can inform future efforts. We've structured this webinar as a series of questions in a conversation with Peter and Sarah. But there are a few of you online right now, and so I encourage you to join us by asking questions towards the end of the webinar. And to do so, please use the chat box. There's a chat option in the Zoom platform. If you just type your question, then I'll pass that on to Sarah and to Peter at the end. The webinar is about 45 minutes long, no more. So if there are any questions that remain unanswered, I think I'm sure we can take this online and continue the conversation directly with Peter and Sarah and with others who might want to join. As I said, I'm recording this webinar, so it will be available on our YouTube platform soon afterwards for you to revisit and to share. Okay, so without further ado, the first question, I think, in everybody's mind, because we all have a definition or a description of the Think Tank Initiative, is what is the Think Tank Initiative? And who better to tell us that than the person who ran the initiative for 8 years, I think, right?
Well, different roles, but yes, part of that time was running it. And thanks, Kike. Great to be on this webinar with you and Sarah. So greetings to everyone from a very snowy Ottawa. What was the Think Tank Initiative? So our opening premise for the Think Tank Initiative, and I'll use the acronym TTI because that's our fond way of referring to the initiative. The opening premise was that developing regions of the world, independent policy research institutions or think tanks are in a unique position to bring about positive change in their societies. Why is that? Because by generating and analyzing credible local data, they can enhance public policy debates, they can provide more objective and evidence-based decision-making that makes real sustained improvements in people's lives. And we know that many development challenges like climate change, like inequalities of different kinds, are global. They have universal implications, and we see that now with Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. But the way they're experienced on the ground in any context is influenced by a wide range of different factors: social, cultural, economic, environmental, and political factors. And as we often hear, context matters. So to bring about positive change or transformation in a specific context, it's really important to have sources of evidence and data and analysis, and sometimes solutions that are also generated in that same context. So if we go along with that basic premise, it follows that organizations who generate and make sense of evidence, data, and analysis related to the challenges experienced in that context, of course engaging with actors in the ecosystem, are really important. And the Think Tank Initiative grew out of a desire to help unlock the potential of these kinds of organizations. So its long-term vision was that policymakers in participating countries consistently use objective, high-quality research to develop and implement policies that lead to more equitable and prosperous societies. So that's quite a mouthful. That was the overall vision of the Think Tank Initiative. And the theory of change, if you will, was that TTI would provide a selected group of think tanks in the Global South with the support they needed to improve the quality of their research, help to strengthen the effectiveness of their organizations, and also to enable their interactions with policymakers, civil society, and the media. And then that would enable them to increase their impact on social and economic policies in their countries and also beyond. So over a 10-year period, from 2009 to 2019, quite recently finished, TTI provided more than 40 think tanks selected from 20 countries in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America with a combination of what we called core or flexible, non-earmarked funding, combined with access to capacity development support. And the intended outcome was that think tanks individually and collectively would help improve their organizational performance, their research quality, and their policy engagement. And there's also another objective, which was to facilitate and share learning about strategies for defining, building, and managing successful, sustainable think tanks. So actually this webinar is a contribution to that objective as well, which is to continue that learning and hopefully to get more buy-in and more engagement from different actors in the work that think tanks do, as well as ideally find alternative and increasing forms of support that can help think tanks do the work they do as well. And just a final point about the think tank initiative, which is really important. It was a partnership of funders, and it was originally conceived and initiated by the Hewlett Foundation. So full credit to former colleagues of Sarah for their brilliant initiative and idea. And they recognized that strengthening policy research institutions takes a long time. That's why the think tank initiative was designed as a 10-year program to give think tanks the time and support they needed to increase their capacity and effectiveness. And once the concept of TTI was born, it became a fully fledged initiative implemented and co-funded by IDRC, where I work, with ongoing support, of course, from the Hewlett Foundation, also from UK Department for International Development, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, NORAD. So it really was a true partnership of a number of funders who were very engaged in this process over a 10-year period.
And if I may ask you a follow-up question before I ask Sarah about the role of the Hewlett Foundation and other funders, just to give us a sense of the magnitude of the scale of the support, that flexible support you provide to think tanks. Can you say something about the amounts, maybe or the range of the amounts that think tanks were receiving over that period of time, so to get a sense of the contribution?
Yeah, the amount provided in terms of the financial support varied from institution to institution, because that depended partly on the size and the scale and the situation that the institution was, and also what its ambitions and aspirations for what it wanted to do afterwards. But let's call them the grants, the size of the financial support over a 5-year period ranged from around 500,000 Canadian dollars up to around 2.5 million Canadian dollars. And the average level of support was around 1.5 million Canadian dollars over a 5-year period. And then that was re-granted for the following 5 years, which made up the full 10-year period. So it varied, though, from institution to institution.
And more or less, what percentage of their overall funding did that was that?
So there was a sort of rule of thumb where the principle was that the contribution of the think tank initiative shouldn't exceed more, in principle, more than 25% of their global operating budget. And that was important because it was, as you can imagine, there was a lot of discussion about potential dependency by an organization on a single source of funding. And if that percentage of the global operating budget had expanded to become larger, 50, 75%, or even fully, then of course the organization would have been dependent on a single source, and it would have made, in effect, that funding determined everything that the organization did. So what we saw over time, in fact, was that many of the organizations actually increased their revenue from different sources over the 10 years, and that the proportion of the TTI contribution became smaller in relation to other sources of income that they had, which was, of course, one of the things that we'd hope to see. And in many cases, that did happen.
Great. Sarah, do you have something to add to the definition or the explanation of what the think tank initiative was?
Rather than add to the definition of it, which I think Peter laid out very well, what I would rather do is step back and think about what is TTI an illustration of. And there's 3 things that come to mind for me. The first is that TTI is an illustration that funders can align philosophically and take the long view when it comes to supporting think tanks or anything else. TTI is, for me, a funder collaboration success story, and we can talk more about why it was a success story if that's interesting to folks, but it really is an illustration of that to me. Second, it is an illustration of the importance of core support. I'm sure this will be a theme that will come out a lot in our conversation today. The support is critical for strengthening institutions and for their positioning for influence, and that it can be used well. I think that TTI has illustrated that really clearly. And the third is something that Peter started with, which is TTI is an illustration of the importance of national institutions and scholars having influence over national policies. TTI is an illustration of a shift in intellectual power from external advisors to national scholars and advisors. And that is something that we need to hold on to in our long view when we think about funding research and about policy influence.
Great, and let me ask you a follow-up question as well, because you've raised it about the collaboration between funders. Has that led to further collaboration between the same funders? Do you feel that there are opportunities for coordinating the work that the TTI funders are going to be doing in the future because of TTI?
Well, IDRC and Hewlett have a long and beautiful relationship, I will tell you that. I mean, I think it started with TTI, but we now also, other colleagues of mine are collaborating with IDRC on the GROW program, which is around women's economic empowerment and research in that field. Another colleague of mine is participating with IDRC in a collaborative project called PEARLS, which is around supporting rapid response institutions to help policymakers access and use evidence in a real-time way. So IDRC and Hewlett have a long-standing relationship, and it is very much always aligned around this philosophy of institutional strengthening, and that the organizations we're supporting know a lot more than we do about what the priorities are in a given locale. And so we're philosophically aligned in how we work together and have been for a long time, which is great. DFID and Hewlett also have partnered, not in kind of a co-funding way, but certainly in a strategic alignment way in a number of areas around data and impact evaluation. The thing that happens with these larger institutions like DFID is that I'll partner with the TTI folks at DFID who don't necessarily talk to the folks working on data for development, who don't necessarily talk to the folks working on impact evaluation. And so while I might see a coherence across all of those of really trying to advance data and evidence use by governments, they themselves might not see that. And so whereas with IDRC, I think it's sort of an institutional relationship, and with DFID, for example, it's more of a programmatic relationship. But yeah, I think that the hours and miles and trust logged under TTI has made us favorably inclined to collaborate with these same funders in other ways.
Great. Right, so
maybe Kike,
yes, go ahead.
just to add really briefly too, because IDRC is also a fund as well as the implementer. And one of the things that we've seen a lot now is that many of the think tanks that receive support through TTI are also receiving support in different ways from the same funders who are involved in TTI. So that's quite exciting, because you can kind of see, it's almost like the appreciation and the respect for those institutions has grown through the familiarity of the funders with the think tanks themselves. The challenge is sometimes, do we do that in an uncoordinated or a coordinated way, so that we are aware that, how we're supporting those organizations, and are they able to use that support as well to ensure that they're kind of putting the organizational dimensions in place, which will really help them to become sustainable organizations. And it's not just a lot of parallel project funding. So that's, there's lots of different collaborations there too.
Great, that's good to know. So let's go to another question around a keyword, impact. When we talk to think tanks about impact, I can expect there'll be a long conversation about what we mean by impact. But what about when we talk to funders about impact? So how do you understand impact when supporting think tanks?
Yeah, I'll start there and be very humble and honest in saying that this is a learning journey for us too as funders. We don't have it all figured out either. So I want to give you kind of 3 stepping stones in my own learning journey around thinking about impact with think tanks. And I want to make sure that we're all starting from the same assumption, of course, which is that think tanks are aiming to have their research be policy relevant and policy influential, as different from academic institutions that might be kind of advancing knowledge, but not necessarily with the same views of influence. So starting with that assumption, I would say that the first milestone on my learning journey about this was early in my experience with TTI. I didn't come onto the scene until the beginning of phase 2, so we're talking 2014. But I really recognized at that time that there was a mismatch between how think tanks were thinking about the world and how think tanks were thinking about results. So when you talk to think tanks, I remember this so vividly from the South Asia regional conference of TTI in 2014 or 2015, that the think tank participants, when they're talking about the world in their research, they start by describing problems and they think about how they can use every asset within their institution to address that problem. There's research, there's convening, there's serving on advisory councils, there's policy briefs, there's social media. They're starting by thinking about a problem that they want to help solve and address. But then we broke out into conversation about results, and they start from the opposite end. They start from, well, we publish a paper, and then maybe we write a brief, and then, well, we had this many events, and we had this many, social media, whatever. How they think about the world, which is starting from the problem, and how they think about results, which is starting from the paper, was a complete disconnect. That was my first observation on this journey under TTI. The second observation was that there was a mismatch between how think tanks thought about the world and how I was thinking about results. So think tanks, I was thinking about, I think probably in the mold of how the Center for Global Development, where I had come from, thought about results, was what were think tanks' big wins? Can you look back over a year or 2 years of think tank activity and identify a handful of big policy wins, the 2 or 3 places that you can point that that your research and your voice and your convening power and your influence had sway over a particular policy outcome. And I was like, that's enough, because not every single paper is going to add to something, and that's okay. You don't want to hold think tanks accountable for, every piece of paper that they produce having some major impact. But you do want to think about, as an institution, can we point to real influence over time? And I think that's an important thing. We can't let go of asking the question at that level, but what asking the question at that level misses is how you get there. I wasn't curious or inquiring or thinking about how do those big wins happen, when are they missed, what ingredients need to be in an institution to achieve them. So on one end, we had a mismatch of starting with the paper. And on the other hand, we have a mismatch of only thinking about the big wins. So the third really important step in my learning journey that I really credit TTI with was something that came through very clearly in the evaluation of TTI, which is a middle ground. Thinking about impact and change at the level of institutional positioning. Positioning means who do they have relationships with? Where do they fit into a broader ecosystem of people influencing policy? What spaces are they invited into? How credible is their research seen? How well do they retain the top scholars that give them a name? These elements of positioning, the evaluation shows us, are critical for influence. They're critical for those big wins we care about. But they're also things that we can affect change in, and we can attribute dollars to, and that think tanks can track their own change in. So I've become much more interested in thinking about impact in this space of institutional positioning, knowing full well it's critical for these big wins. We still need to make sure they happen, but it's so much richer than starting with the paper. And it really helps you think about, from an institutional perspective, how we're influencing and how well positioned are we for that. So I feel that this third point on my learning journey is really credited to TTI and to the evaluation and to understanding this relationship between core support and institutional strengthening and positioning, and then that influence that we seek.
Peter, sorry, I was muted. Do you share some of these reflections? What is your take on how to define, how to understand impact when supporting think tanks?
Yeah, well, I'll be equally humble, as Sarah said at the beginning, because this question of, what is impact, we could have like 10 webinars, and I'm sure you have already, just thinking about that. And IGRC as an organization that funds research is thinking a lot about this at the moment. We talk about high quality research for impact. So it's really important for us as an organization, and it was really important for us as we were thinking about supporting think tanks. I agree with Sarah very much that this idea of a kind of the notion of a sort of linear model where, okay, research is produced, there's some kind of output, there's a publication, and then somehow miraculously you get some kind of big win in terms of a policy change. I think that's widely understood not to be a very good description of the way the world works, because as I said earlier, there are a lot of different factors which play out in every context, whether it's societal, environmental, political, cultural, economic, which determine what actually happens. And there's lots of different kinds of interventions which lead to change. So it's because it's easy to say it's complex, but it is complex, and that's something which I think is important to acknowledge, and then to sort of imagine different ways in which think tanks actually have an impact. There are a few ways just to complement what Sarah said. I think one of the ones which has interested me increasingly is the way in which think tanks shape and influence societal behaviors, because we know now that there's a huge sort of discourse around the value of evidence and data. We hear it all the time. I'm not going to use some of the which we all hear, especially at the moment, around how people understand the value of evidence. But if think tanks are going to play that role as co-constructors and generators of evidence and engagers of evidence with a range of different actors, then they need to be able to model consistent, transparent, and credible behavior. And that means things like, for example, stating who their funders are, what are their funding sources and affiliations, what's their ideological stance, if they have one. Because, to portray yourself as an organization which apparently produces objective data and analysis, but in fact to have a whole range of other agendas which are not shared transparently, I think undermines the credibility of the evidence and the data, and it makes people suspicious of what these organizations are offering. And if think tanks want to really have an impact on the way in which evidence is valued in society, I think it's important that they're also modeling what that means and how they go about generating and engaging others around it. Another thing which we've seen a lot, and I've really appreciated from the experience of TTI, is the convening power of think tanks. Because we talk a lot now about sort of evidence and policy ecosystems, which involve lots of different actors, lots of relationships, lots of different groups, organizations within the system who are all contributing in different ways. So we've seen many examples from the TTI history of where think tanks in their national contexts have acted as conveners, and they've supported movements of positive change by bringing together those different actors in a crowded ecosystem. And it's really helpful when there's so many different channels of information, different kinds of knowledge which are being generated in different ways, and many different voices in the mix who sort of would claim to be representative. So having that ability to bring people together and to be trusted and respected to do that, again, in a transparent and credible way, seems really important. But there's also a danger that think tanks, especially as their reputation grows, they can be seen as one of the sort of intellectual elites in society and gradually move away from being that representative of a convener which has the sort of greater good in mind and is trying to sort of support change by bringing evidence and data. So I think those are two lessons that I would pick out. Also, I think Sarah's mentioned that, just around how we understand research quality and positioning, hugely important. One of the big discussions we had throughout the history of TTI is, well, what do we mean by research quality? Different people have different interpretations of that as well. Sometimes the question was, well, is this kind of research that think tanks do the same kind of research that you might find, say, in a university or other kinds of institution? But I think one of the important things is really looking at research quality from a much sort of broader perspective, and understanding some of it is for sure about the rigor and the validity, through all of the sort of normal metrics that you'd expect to see. But it's also about the importance and the relevance of the research. Is it actually speaking to an issue? Is it connecting with something which is needed in society? How do think tanks position themselves in relation to other actors to sort of take that forward? And how much do they really take account of the context in which they're in, so that they are engaging in different ways with different actors with that sort of higher process of change in mind? So these are things which certainly have struck me, and they've generated a lot of debate as well with many people who've been interested in the program, and a lot of lessons.
Thank you. I mean, it strikes me now that, of course, this experience has also made us think about impact in a much broader sense, right? Not just the think tank as a unit of analysis, that also the because I know that TTI spend a lot of time dealing with individuals within the think tanks. So the individuals who are leading the think tanks are also the subject of support, and therefore there's a question of what does impact mean for those who were engaging with the program. Are they better managers? Are they better leaders? Do they understand the context better and their organizations better? And what about those who are coming next, right? Who are next in line to take on those responsibilities? And at the same time, as you mentioned, Peter, the context. Are think tanks, by their actions or their new behaviors, influencing their ecosystem in a positive way? Right? Not everybody got funding from TTI, but is TTI funding or anybody else's funding able to support other organizations to play in tandem, right? To play in parallel with the think tanks that are getting that support? It's very hard to sustain these sort of these sort of islands of excellence in a country if alone they'll slowly kind of perish. So many.
I would say though that, Enrique, each of those things that you've just outlined fits within thinking about impact from a positioning perspective.
Right.
Who your people are, how you relate with other people, how you manage transitions, all of those things that you've just outlined fit very nicely in a discussion about impact and change in terms of institutional positioning.
Right. Good. And it also links up to the Research Quality Plus framework that IDRC developed along the same time. But it also talks about readiness for impact of research and relevance and integrity, and looks at quality from a point of view of values, which I think is an interesting parallel. Might help to understand impact at different levels. Anyway, so different impacts or different objectives when supporting think tanks. Of course, this has implications on how we support think tanks. So, Peter, do you want to go first and tell us what you've learned about how to support think tanks?
Yeah, so I mean, as we said right at the beginning, the biggest part of the modality of TTI was to provide this what we call core funding, long-term flexible financial support, and that our external evaluation had really demonstrated the value of that, because there's lots of questions around, well, does that really make a difference? And the evaluation, drawing on a lot of evidence that they collected of the ways in which think tanks made a difference, but also the way that support made a difference to the think tanks themselves, was that it was extremely important. And yet, at the same time, it's very limited. Those kinds of sources of funding are very difficult to get, because we know that a lot of funding that think tanks access is still intended for specific projects, and that many are driven to have to undertake more commissioned research and consultancies, which means that they're often following the priorities of different funders and may have a very sort of complex portfolio, which makes it harder for them to take a longer term view of future issues, trends, and opportunities. And also they're having to shift their attention from one thing to another, engaging with different actors. And it's harder as well for them to recruit and retain research staff who can grow with the organization over time if they don't have that, at least some basic security of support. Now, Sarah, I'm sure, we'll talk about kind of what are the different ways in which think tanks can have access to that more stable support. And providing this sort of core funding is one of those mechanisms. But there are others, like ensuring that, when funders are providing support to think tanks, that they're actually costing the costing of the project and the work, and that people's time is well done. And that's the responsibility of the think tanks themselves to cost their work. But it's also a responsibility of funders to recognize that if you don't cover certain essential costs which think tanks need to run, then they're not going to exist at all and able to, to do the kind of work that we would all like to see. So there's lots of sort of questions around ways in which that financial support can be provided, but ensuring that there is at least some element which is flexible and offered over a long time, so that think tanks can really establish a strong base and work from there. So that financial part was a really important part of the support. But the other part, though, was around capacity development support. And the model of TTI was that there were sort of three core areas where that support was provided. One was to help think tanks really strengthen the quality of their research, so around research methods and all the kind of different approaches to ensure that there was a really sort of robust quality assurance and methodologies and people within the organization who could do, really good, solid research. And then a lot of support around policy and engagement and communications, because again, for all the reasons we've said, that ability of think tanks to engage, connect with, convene, and bridge with different actors in society around public policy issues is a really important part of that function. And communication, of course, capacity is really central to all of that. And then there's just general organizational effectiveness. So having the right strategies, the systems, the functions, strong leadership, strong governance mechanisms, all the things that we know are important to organizations. Providing support which would help those organizations to develop those was another really important part of the program. But a lot of lessons about that, because there were quite a diverse range of capacity strengthening modalities were used, which included things like training, things like peer learning, exchanges, bringing think tanks together. But another really important part of the program, which was highlighted by the evaluation, was the support from program officers within the think tank initiative who engaged directly with people within the think tanks, particularly the leaders of think tanks, but other staff as well. And they were able to provide very sort of tailored support. They were able to engage if questions were arising in real time. They could interact, they could provide advice, they could provide guidance, or just be a sounding board for ideas that people within the think tanks themselves felt were important. So that was another form of the support that I think was probably the impact of that was a bit underestimated at the beginning. But as time went on, we realized having that trusted, responsive, and sort of respectful mutual relationship between people who had expertise around social and economic research issues, but also increasingly knew a lot about working with think tanks and providing support of different kinds. That relationship was a huge component of the support itself, which I think in the end was probably one of the most significant factors. And I think the evaluators also pointed out that having the core financial support was crucial, but the ability then to use in constructive, powerful ways was the key success factor, if you like, to think tanks making good use of that funding and making good use of that support.
Sarah?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to all of that is to just underscore this last point and to give a huge shout out to the IDRC regional program officers, because this combination of core support plus basically a coach, mentor, partner really proved successful for institutional strengthening and capacity development. Not just for all the things that we always think about core support being useful for, setting your own research agenda, hiring people. For institutional strengthening and capacity development, the combination of core, you get to choose, and the TTI think tanks, participating think tanks, were asked on a periodic basis to develop their own priority plans for where they wanted to strengthen their institutional capacities, use their core support for that, with the nudging and encouragement and mentorship and partnership and brokering of different resources of the regional program officers. That combination proved not only valuable for all the things we thought core support was going to be valuable for, but proved more valuable for capacity development and strengthening than targeted capacity development efforts. And that is a huge takeaway for me from TTI.
And can I ask you so a question that relates to the premise of the TTI about how to support think tanks? And I think one of the things, Sarah, you highlighted was that you were trying to sort of bring the discussion to the local level, right? So it was local evidence for local policy challenges. But one of the things that many think tanks still struggle with in developing countries is to make sure that the money is also local, that the funding or that the support that is coming to them is also local, which would probably help with a lot of the discussions that think tanks have with their funders, sort of explaining the complexity of the context and the intricacies of each circumstance that they're dealing with. And is there, I mean, this is probably going into the lessons learned, or lessons to be learned, but is there anything about support to think tanks, any way in which support to think tanks could be done so that you are either leveraging domestic funding or you are doing it through domestic institutions?
Peter, do you want to start?
Well, I mean, let's say the availability of domestic institutions and funders who have resources who are willing and interested to make available funding to think tanks is that's one of the big challenges I think that we've encountered. There are emerging bodies of funding arriving. Actually, IDRC has a program called the Science Granting Research Council Initiative, which is actually helping support social science granting councils in a number of different countries, particularly in Africa, to sort of strengthen the way in which they're developing and implementing their domestic funding strategies. Because grant making is it's a combination of an art and a science, as we often hear, and there's helping to nurture the availability of that is very important. We also know, of course, there are private sector actors, corporations, business sector who are interested, for example, in corporate social responsibility, who are also, participating increasingly in societal questions and thinking, well, how can evidence, how can analysis, how can data help to resolve that? And of course, some of them are interested because they work in the domains of data and information. Well, so I think there's a lot of potential for think tanks to scope and scan and access different forms of domestic funding. But I'm not sure that in many contexts yet, the domestic funders themselves are quite seeing think tanks as having enough visibility. And we, for a number of years, we did a policy community survey where we asked different people within the sort of funding, in the policy landscape, in different national contexts, where did they go to for data, for analysis, for information on a whole range of development problems. What did they think of that when they found it, about the quality, and also what did they think about the way in which think tanks engaged? And one of the things that came through very clearly was that even though we saw think tanks communicating much more effectively throughout the life of the think tank initiative, engaging more powerfully, they're operating in an increasingly crowded field. So they're competing for attention with a lot of noise, a lot of voices, a lot of information which is flowing from all different kinds of sources, and many of that is being generated globally as well. So how do they carve out that visibility in that space within all of that background noise to really present themselves as having something to offer which is valuable and worth funding? And I think the better that they become at doing that, also through really strong leadership, good governance, because one of the roles as well of governors and trustees of think tanks is also to help raise the visibility, raise the profile, engage with different funders, and just keep the conversation going about what it is that organizations of this kind can bring to society through the work that they do. So I think opportunities are going to increase, but it needs a sort of multi-pronged effort. Sometimes nourishing, helping strengthen the availability of funding, but also helping think tanks to increasingly raise their visibility and demonstrate their relevance and how they position themselves, as Sarah said earlier.
Great. So, and why don't we move on to the next question about lessons, because I think we're already talking about them. So what have we learned? And one of the questions from the audience, from Regine, is what aspects didn't work? And what things would you redesign if you had to? So lessons, what have we learned or are yet to learn from this initiative? Sarah?
Yeah, the first one I had in mind, I think, responds to Regine's question, which is we have learned, as I've now said, that helping strengthen institutional capacity can and should be done through core support. That core support is one of the best mechanisms to institutionally strengthen. And one of the things that we learned is that the offer-led capacity development, where you offer a workshop, you kind of pull everybody and, everybody wants help on fundraising strategies or on communication strategies. So you hire a facilitator and you have a workshop for 2 days and the executive director comes, that approach didn't stick. And there was a great review done by Vanessa Weyrich of the phase 1 capacity development strategy under TTI that found that kind of approach didn't stick, and that she had 3 recommendations. One, see if I can remember them. One is that there is no one size fits all. You have to tailor the capacity development to the actual needs and capacities of each institution. The other, that it needs to be more participatory in design. And the third was it needs to be more segmented in delivery. And those lessons that came from really that just kind of not much happening from the initial capacity development efforts went into a complete redesign of capacity development efforts under phase 2. And so what we learned is what didn't really work. We also learned that core support does help on institutional strengthening. But what we have yet to learn, because the timing of the evaluation was such, is whether these more creative, participatory, segmented approaches that were used under phase 2 really did yield better results in terms of capacity development. So there was an action learning model by which there was a topic that over time a facilitator would convene people in person around budgeting and financing or around gender in think tanks. They would work together, they'd go home with homework and develop plans and implement what they learned in their organizations, come back together over a period of a year, this sustained, collaborative, partnership-oriented learning. Or in Latin America, the model you know well, of having a network of institutions identify their capacity development needs and then calling on each other to provide that kind of capacity development support. Those were 2 experiments in phase 2 that we don't yet know whether they yielded better results. So I'm quite eager for more learning there. The other 2 quick things I would say about what we know juxtaposed with what we have yet to learn. We know that again and again the importance of core support, but we learned that the evaluation tells us that even 10 years of flexible core support does not inoculate institutions from future financial vulnerability. It makes them much better positioned if they've used it well to diversify their resources. But it's not, you can't just give them core support for 10 years and then they've got it all figured out, right? There is an eternal issue of fundraising and financial sustainability. And we also learned that funders, not many funders are doing core support. So I think that what is yet to be learned, both by funders and by think tanks, and Peter started to make this point, is how do you get more flexibility and institutional support from otherwise more constrained financing instruments? Part of that is in properly, fully budgeting and understanding your true costs and getting those into your budgets. Partly it is understanding, starting from the change you want to have and making sure that you're accounting for all the parts of your institution affecting that change. Too often project support is, we're going to write this paper, pay us to write this paper, and you forget about all of the institutional pieces that need to be in place to have that paper have influence. So I think we have yet to learn more about the business models and the revenue generation models that think tanks can use, and that funders themselves and think tanks themselves have a lot more to learn still, and how to get more flexibility out of rigid financing instruments. And then the last thing, and this is one that's near and dear to my heart and is really core to our broader grant making at Hewlett, is we have learned that think tanks are a very important part of a policy ecosystem. They're bringing evidence into policy decision making, and that local knowledge matters for that. But what we have yet to learn is how think tanks can go beyond just influencing with their own research around a discrete set of policy questions in a discrete moment. How can think tanks play a role? They're so well positioned to do this, but how can they play a role in fostering and supporting a broader culture of evidence use and political expectations that evidence will be used? And so this is not about, it's not only about what governments decide in a given moment and whether or not your research was used. It is about how governments make decisions and the degree to which evidence is a more sustained and ongoing part of that. We yet have to learn what think tanks' role is in that broader shift.
And would it be fair to say also, I mean, another way of putting that is we need to learn how to support think tanks and at the same time support the other institutions of that policy research ecosystem that are going to achieve those results. So, for example, universities, the media, political parties, unions or associations with trade or business, etc., government. So it's that coordination between supporting think tanks and also supporting these other bodies that are important for think tanks to do their job well, for think tanks to raise the profile of evidence and the value of evidence as well.
I think that's one piece of it, and I think there's two other pieces at least. The other piece is think tanks themselves thinking more systemically.
Right.
For example, what is the barrier to the Minister of Finance not only using my research, but somebody else's? Is it a capacity barrier? Is it a political incentive barrier? How can I reduce those barriers as a think tank and in partnership with others? The second piece is really a call to funders. All funders that support data and impact evaluation and policy research presumably are doing it, at least policy-oriented funders, because they seek a change in policy, or as one reason. Yet, very few funders are thinking systemically about, is that research getting used, why or why not, and what can I do about the many conditions and barriers that hinder government use of research or other forms of evidence. You see very few funders thinking about, beyond funding the research, what am I doing on the supply side, on the use side, to increase the uptake of evidence? So it's what you said plus those other two, at least.
At least, I'm sure with many things we are yet to learn. Peter, what about you? What did you learn? I'd be curious about, if you had not taken notes of that, but I'd be curious to know about what you learned as running this program as well.
Well, I can see that there's probably a webinar part 2 on all of this because there's so much to talk about. But I think one of the things that I certainly learned is that it's important to really embrace adaptability and flexibility as you go. You have to still keep your sort of eye on the prize of what it is that you're trying to do ultimately. But it was one of the comments by the evaluators that I really appreciated is that they looked at the think tank initiative with 43 organizations supported, and they said, well, there were 43 unique organizations. So all of those organizations have their own character, they're in their own context, they have their own histories, they have their own people, and they're subject to sort of internal dynamics, of course, but they're also in an external context which is also constantly changing, and sometimes that's political, or it could be economic, or it could be environmental factors. I remember our colleagues in Nepal still managed to somehow keep going even when the earthquake hit, and they had no power and they couldn't get around Kathmandu. Just basic things like that are the kinds of challenges that think tanks have to work with on a daily basis. So I think one of the lessons for me, as in the role that I had with the program, was trying to be able to adjust and adapt, recognizing the challenging conditions that individual think tanks were facing, but also to try to help them connect as much as possible, to share experiences with each other. Because I think one of the powerful learning processes of TTI was that exchange. We had a number of what we call think tank initiative exchanges. The last one was a year ago, actually, in Bangkok. And you could just see the energy that people had to want to learn from each other, and I hope that like a webinar like this can sort of help to continue that kind of energy of shared learning and peer exchange, because that was really powerful. And we saw some really interesting things come out of it. The Southern Voice network of think tanks, which is going from strength to strength, emerged out of a group of think tanks at one of those exchanges, coming together and asking the question, how could we, in our position as think tanks based in the Global South, actually the knowledge asymmetries and power imbalances inherent in global development as the MDGs were coming to an end and the SDGs, well, what became the SDGs were being discussed. And they managed to get great traction, and they're continuing their work, even though the think tank initiative has ended. And with the Hewlett Foundation, IGRC, together, we've been able to support them going forward. So that was sort of seeing an opportunity that grew out of the collectivization of the organizations within TTI, and then helping them to take that forward. So it's being responsive, observing what's coming out and helping provide that support. The other thing I think too that was a really important lesson for me for the think tanks' own experience was their capacity to reflect on themselves as organizations in that broader context. And when the selection for TTI took place, there were hundreds of applicant organizations. Sadly, we could only support a limited number of think tanks, but the process went through involved a lot of self-reflection about who they were, what it was they were trying to do, where they saw themselves in 5 or 10 years' time, and what would they need to do to take that forward. many of those organizations at the time didn't have a strategy, they didn't have communication staff. There were many things that they were doing, but they didn't necessarily have all the things in place, which they gradually acquired later. But the thing I saw very strongly was an increased capacity to reflect as organizations. And we supported that sometimes with action learning and action research processes that I think was a good methodology, which helped tap into that ability of organizations to reflect on who they were, where they want to go, and also how could they share the lessons they learned along the way. So providing a kind of enabling environment for that sharing to happen was also something that I think was an important lesson for TTI. And hopefully things like that can continue going forward.
I hope so too. Yes, I think the community aspect of the TTI is one that should not be understated. It is quite amazing here in Latin America, where I'm sitting. The engagement that has taken place across borders and also globally, which I think is one of the true legacies of the TTI. So we've come to an end of the webinar. I want to thank you, Peter and Sarah, for your time and for sharing these lessons. And I might take you up, Peter, and we'll organize a version 2 of the webinar to address some of the other lessons that we've learned and that we yet to learn. I hope for those who were online, this was entertaining and informative at the same time. And as I said, this has been recorded, so we'll be sharing the video through our YouTube channel, our website, and through our various communication channels. That's it from us. So thank you for joining us, and I hope you'll join future webinars soon. Thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sarah. Hope to see you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.